When most people think of an Old West saloon, they picture swinging doors, whiskey, card games, and gunmen waiting for trouble. But the real saloon was usually much more than that. It was a place where business was done, news spread fast, deals were made, and local power often took shape right at the bar. Cowboys, lawmen, outlaws, gamblers, and travelers all passed through the same room, but not for the reasons movies usually show. And once you strip away the Hollywood version, what was really going on inside these saloons turns out to be a lot more interesting. Number 1. The room. The first thing movies get wrong is the space itself. A real Western saloon was not automatically a giant hall with one piano, one staircase, and one perfect line for a gunfight. One preserved example from Skagway, Alaska, shows how different the real thing could be. The building went up in 1898, later became an all-saloon first floor, and the doors behind the bar led either to an adjacent business or to a gambling area. There were no bar stools. Customers stood to drink and talk, with a bar rail, brass spittoons, and bar towels along the counter. That detail matters because it tells you the room was built for traffic, quick service, and constant interaction, not for people settling into a long, quiet evening. And it sat inside a boomtown world where saloons multiplied fast. Skagway reportedly had around 80 saloons in January 1899, with some accounts claiming more than 100 bars during the rush. Gardner, near Yellowstone, was said to have 21 saloons in 1883, and a visitor in 1889 claimed that 28 of the town's 32 buildings were saloons. In Douglas, Wyoming, a frontier settlement began as 3 tents, a general store, a restaurant, and a saloon. So the saloon was not some side detail in Western towns. In many places, it was one of the first businesses to appear, one of the fastest to multiply, and one of the clearest signs that a camp was trying to become a town. Number 2. Why they came. People did not walk into saloons only to drink or start trouble. They went because a saloon bundled together things the town often did not offer anywhere else. Food was part of the draw. At the Mascot in Skagway, free lunches included clam chowder, spare ribs, sauerkraut, and enchiladas. Beer from a local brewery sold for a nickel a schooner. Cigars were available. There was a pool table, gambling, nightly music, and later even a Victor talking machine used for electric concerts. Telegraph wires brought in sports results, and newspapers were read aloud at the bar so everyone could follow the news together. During the gold rush, exhausted stampeders could even roll out a bedroll on the floor and sleep before heading back on the trail. That is a very different picture from the simple movie version of silent men staring into whiskey glasses. A saloon could be a lunch counter, news service, club room, betting space, and entertainment venue all at once. And the free lunch was not just generosity. Owners understood that food brought people in and kept them drinking. Once you see that, the bartender looks different too. In Skagway, one popular bartender later became mayor. That only makes sense if the bar was part of the town's public life and not just its shady underside. A person behind the counter often heard the gossip first, saw the local alliances forming, and knew who had money, who had influence, and who was in trouble. Number 3. Who was there? The standard image gives you one kind of person inside the saloon. A white cowboy, maybe an outlaw, maybe a lawman, maybe a gambler. The real West was more mixed than that, and the room reflected the world around it, even when access was unequal. The Library of Congress notes that Western settlement after the Civil War included white migrants from the East, African American settlers, and Chinese railroad workers, while the destruction of the bison and the spread of white settlement deeply damaged Native American life and pushed many Native communities onto reservations by the 1880s. The same source also points out that the first cowboys were Spanish vaqueros, and that black cowboys rode the range as well. So the people living around western towns were never as uniform as the legend made them look. You can see that complexity inside saloon history too. In Virginia City, Nevada, William A.G. Brown ran the Boston Saloon between 1866 and 1875, serving the town's African-American community. And archaeologists found evidence of finely prepared meals made with the best cuts of meat. That is not the story most people picture when they hear the words Old West Saloon, but it is part of the record. At the same time, diversity did not mean equality. In Skagway, the National Park Service notes that only some saloons allowed people of color to drink inside. So the real point is not that saloons were open, modern spaces. It is that they stood inside a Western society that was ethnically mixed, economically unequal, and shaped by conquest, migration, labor, and exclusion at the same time. Number 4. Women and access. The simple rule people repeat is that saloons were male spaces, full stop. That is partly true, but it is still too simple. Before Prohibition, the restaurant world at the turn of the 20th century still leaned heavily male. The National Park Service describes hotels, bar restaurants, and working-class saloons as largely male preserves.
But that is not the same as saying women were absent from everything happening around them. In Skagway, women and children originally had to use a separate family entrance and were not allowed to socialize with men at the bar because of Alaska law. Another Park Service page notes that women could use a side door to purchase alcohol to go, which tells you they were part of the saloon economy even when barred from the main public room. Then the rules tightened further. By 1903, Skagway forced saloons to close on Sundays and barred women from entry altogether. At the same time, archaeologists working on Western sites have pushed back against the old assumption that frontier drinking spaces were purely male worlds. A National Park Service release on Oregon archaeology points to a woman-run brewery and notes that women and children were present in spaces long assumed to be male-dominated. Around many saloons, you also found dance halls and houses of ill fame, which is one reason outsiders later treated the whole saloon district as a symbol of vice. In Gardner, in 1883, records mentioned 21 saloons, 4 houses of ill fame, plus billiard and dance halls. So the real story is not that women were simply inside or outside. Access was controlled, moralized, and uneven, and the public life around saloons was more complicated than the all-male movie version suggests. Number 5. Guns and order. This is where the movie version really takes over. People imagine that every decent saloon came with a shattered mirror, a fistfight, and a gunfight before midnight. The historical record is much less theatrical. Research on cattle towns notes that the myth of constant violence mostly comes from Western movies, and that those towns were not nearly as violent as popular culture suggests. A Yale Law Journal article makes the same point from a legal angle. The 19th century West was more regulated than the legend. Visitors to places like Dodge City and Tombstone could not lawfully bring firearms past city limits, and the gunfight at the OK Corral was tied in part to enforcement of Tombstone's gun rules. That does not mean saloons were peaceful in any modern sense. Skagway newspapers reported fighting, men pulling pistols, and stones thrown through the mascot's plate glass windows. Douglas had bar brawls and the occasional gunfight during its roughest years. But those details matter for the opposite reason people think. They show that disorder existed inside a framework where towns were already trying to control it. Lawmen were not standing in the middle of some pure free-for-all. They were usually dealing with places that had licensing systems, Sunday closing rules, city gun ordinances, or pressure from residents who wanted the town to feel less temporary and more stable. So, when a Western saloon did turn violent, that was not proof that the whole place ran without rules. More often, it showed what happened when a crowded room full of money, liquor, pride, and local rivalries pushed against rules that were already there. Number 6. Business and power. A saloon was also a business machine, and sometimes a political one. In Skagway, a new law in 1899 required saloons to pay a $1,500 license fee, and the number reportedly dropped from about 80 in January to only a dozen by April. That is not a frontier fantasy world.
That is licensing, capital pressure, and local government deciding who could afford to stay open. The owners who survived remodeled aggressively, added club rooms and cigar stands, sold free lunches, and used telegraph connections to keep the bar interesting. They were competing for traffic the same way later businesses competed for headlines, music, or exclusive features. The staff mattered too. Park Service records describe the mascot's bartenders as approachable, and one of them, Chris Shea, later became mayor. That shows how blurry the line could be between respectable civic life and saloon life. In Douglas, the pattern is just as telling. After the railroad arrived and permanent settlers came in, they brought religion, government, finance, and law. But bar rooms were still so central that early church services were held inside them, with a makeshift barrier set up across the bar and a card table used as an altar. That image says a lot about the real West. The saloon was not always the opposite of public life. Sometimes it was simply the biggest, busiest, and most usable indoor space around. So if you picture old Western towns as neatly divided between good citizens in one building and bad men in another, the ground-level history keeps breaking that picture apart. Money, politics, religion, and drinking were often sharing the same block, and sometimes the same room. Number 7. Reform and pressure. Once you understand how much social power sat inside these rooms, the anti-saloon campaigns make more sense. Reformers were not focused on saloons only because people drank there. They targeted them because saloons were tied to masculine public culture, neighborhood politics, labor routines, family spending, and what many reformers saw as organized vice. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in the 1870s, made closing saloons one of its major goals through nonviolent activism and laws restricting alcohol sales. By 1905, leadership of the broader prohibition movement had shifted to the Anti-Saloon League, which built a hard, single-issue strategy and pushed local dry votes first, then state prohibition. In its own way, that movement treated the saloon as a political institution as much as a drinking room. Skagway shows how this pressure worked on the ground. The town forced Sunday closing in 1903, barred women from entry that same year, and voted dry in 1916, shutting the mascot along with the rest of the local saloons. National prohibition came later, but many Western towns were already experimenting with control before 1920. And when prohibition arrived, it helped open space for different kinds of public eating places. The National Park Service notes that before prohibition, the restaurant world was dominated by hotels, bar restaurants, and working-class saloons, all largely male territory. Afterward, tea rooms, luncheonettes, cafeterias, and soda fountains expanded as alternatives. So the history of the saloon is also the history of a bigger argument over what a public place should be: loud or respectable, male or mixed, wet or dry, politically connected or morally cleaned up. Number 8. The myth gap. By the time later generations started looking back at the Old West, the saloon had become a perfect stage prop. It gave filmmakers one room where the cowboy myth, the outlaw myth, and the lawman myth could all collide at once. But the same historical record that weakens the myth of the heroic white cowboy also weakens the myth of the saloon, built only for showdown scenes. The Library of Congress describes the late 19th century West as a crossroads of cultures shaped by struggles over property, profit, and cultural dominance, not a simple frontier tale. Research on cattle towns says the violence was overstated. Local history from Skagway shows a saloon that sold beer, cigars, meals, news, music, and sports updates, used free lunch to pull customers in, pushed people through a standing room bar, connected to gambling space behind the counter, and sat under changing rules about women, race, licensing, Sundays, and alcohol bans. Nevada history shows that at least some saloons also served specific black communities and offered far better food than the stereotype suggests. Archaeology in Oregon has even forced historians to rethink the assumption that all drinking spaces were sealed male worlds. Put together, the record does not give one clean myth. It gives a crowded place that could be a business, a rumor exchange, a meal stop, a labor hangout, a community marker, a vice district anchor, a political network, and a target for reform, sometimes all in the same week. In practice, the room was already full of arguments over access, money, entertainment, race, work, and local order long before anybody reached for a revolver.